In this video, we're going to go ahead and move on to working on the wings rather than finishing on the mouth region, because that's mostly repeating what we already did on the lower mouth portion. This is one of the secondary sections of the main wing, and I used the strokes tool the same way I did on the tail and most of the appendages on the body, by just creating a couple loops and then one cross section and letting 3D Coat generate all the geometry for me. I'm using the brush tool to relax in localized areas. And you can use slide edges with the control key held down to slide entire edge loops if you need. So I'm working on another section of the main wing. Same technique. And I'm just having to speed up the playback in order to make this series as brief as possible. We could use other tools like the quads tool or points and faces to close the ends off. It's really just a matter of preference. And one little trick I'm trying here is using the brush tool by holding the shift key to smooth, and it actually draws that geometry toward the very end. And then I just use the cap tool to cap it off. So what I'm doing now is I clicked on Mark Seams in the UV subsection to go ahead and lay out my UVs while I'm working on these individual parts. It's actually very, very simple. You just mark your seams wherever you want to separate your individual islands, hit unwrap, and 3D Coat will unfold them and pack them all into your UV space. I'm just rearranging them a little bit as far as the layout is concerned. Just trying to make it tidy as best I can. Okay, so now that's done. Just going to use the strokes tool again to close this end off. So this is the rear wing. Doing the same thing, just selecting the seams, hit unwrap. And doing this isn't necessary. Again, I'm just trying to make it look as tidy as possible. With that done, I'm now creating some blank Retopo layer copies and naming them appropriately. The eye and the teeth and the tongue. So we'll create a new UV set for the eye. There are actually two pairs of eyes, so so I'm going to go back to the voxel room, which has since been renamed Sculpt Room, and I'm going to uncache some of the layers that I had cached, and the layers that we'll be working on here, such as the eyes, the teeth, and the tongue. And just to quickly explain, this is basically 3D Coat's equivalent of subdivision levels inside of other sculpting applications. The way 3D Coat works is that at any point in time on any given layer, you can cache the layer. 3D Coat will save and store that version onto your hard drive, and in its place it will provide a lower resolution proxy. You, the user, determine just how low resolution that proxy is by going to the voxel or the geometry menu, and under proxy visualization you can tell 3D Coat just how much you want to step down in resolution. And so when you do that, at the moment you cache, 3D Coat is going to save your current state on your hard drive, and again it's going to leave that low resolution proxy behind, which you can work on. So it gives you the same functionality as stepping down into subdivision levels, but you also have the added benefit of 3D Coat using a lot less memory while you're working. So what I was doing here is just cleaning up or reordering the hierarchy of the child layers for the teeth. And I'm going to skip forward for just a moment until I'm finished here. Next thing we're going to do is use Auto Retopo for objects like this, because each one is somewhat primitive in shape, and this can save you a lot of time when you have repeating types of objects like this. Maybe you have individual scales or something like that, or rivets or screws, bolts on hard surface objects. It's also really effective for a host of secondary objects like buckles, belts, bracelets, things of that sort, or even armor plates. But it's when you are working on the more complex shaped objects that you may elect to instead use the manual retopology tools. A character in the face region is probably one example. Maybe the fingers or the hands of a character, you may want to use manual retopology tools. It really just depends on your needs and how clean the geometry has to be. So yeah, on the vast majority of your model, a character model, you can use Auto Retopo on, but maybe for the face region, I probably would elect again to use manual retopology tools. And that's where the strokes tool comes in very handy, because while you're sketching, as I mentioned before, while you're sketching out your topology, when you're done sketching, you can simply hit enter and 3D Coat creates that mesh for you. So that in itself is somewhat of an auto retopology tool in its own right. So what I'm doing here is applying stroke guides, because I'm trying to tell the algorithm, hey, make sure you place edge loops along this area. And if your model is symmetrical, you want to make sure you turn symmetry on prior to generating an Auto Retopo mesh, and you should get a much cleaner result. So I selected the lower row layer, and 3D Coat is going to generate a mesh just for that layer. So it came out pretty well, as you can see. So I'll select the upper tooth, and I'll right click on that layer to run auto retopo, and it memorizes whatever strokes you may have created. It memorizes whatever paint selections you may have made for 3D Coat to generate a higher degree of polygonal density. So it memorizes all those different settings unless you clear them ahead of time. I did a fairly good job for the most part, but there are a couple areas that we probably want to clean up. So I'm going to reattempt to do this again. I'll just delete that layer that it created. Run auto retopo again. What I need to do now on this one particular object is relax the geometry and also delete some of the edge loops. This is the finished result on all the teeth. And also use the Mark Seams tool to quickly apply UV seams to each of these teeth. And I just hit unwrap, and it unfolded all of the teeth onto a single UV map. When you unwrap, 3D Coat will pack all your islands in, and it will scale your islands proportionally. So in many cases, you may decide to just leave the arrangement or the layout as is. But in this case, I decided to spend a little extra time to make sure that the islands were laid out in a little bit more orderly fashion, so they're easier to spot when you're working in the 2D texture editor in the Paint workspace. So just inspecting all the different UV maps, and you can cycle between them in the upper left hand corner. I've already done all the UVs on the body. And so now we're ready to begin the texture baking process. So I go to the Retopo menu, and I'm going to check Use Name Correspondence. And it has a little feature that will check to see whether or not your layers correspond to one another, because the naming has to be exact. And what 3D Coat's going to do is it's going to look for a correspondence between your voxel layers and your Retopo layers. And when you do that, when you check that option, 3D Coat is going to look for that correspondence and bake those together one at a time in sequence. So that effectively eliminates errors that naturally occur whenever you're trying to bake at once several objects that may be touching or occluding one another during the baking process. So rather than having to explode the bake or having to stop and bake them one at a time manually, 3D Coat does this all for you in an automated fashion. So if you'll notice, you have an inner and an outer baking cage, and you have options to click on one or the other to preview it, and you can adjust the inner and outer amount and see the changes before you begin the baking process. The first dialog was your bake skin settings. This one is for per pixel painting, and it gives you the option to bake occlusion while you're going through this process. You could opt now, if you want, to wait till you're in the Paint workspace to do it. So this third dialog is all your import or merging settings. What 3D Coat is going to do is create copies of your Retopo meshes and send them to the Paint workspace. This is what is meant by the term merging. So when 3D Coat merges this copy over to the Paint workspace, you have the option to subdivide your mesh if you want. And this is especially helpful if you want to do some further sculpting or tweaking to your mesh in the tweak room at the later stages of your project. And sometimes you do. This is also the dialog where you would want to apply auto UVs if for some reason you don't have the time to create your own UVs. You could just do that here, and 3D Coat will do that for you. Or you could elect to keep the UVs you currently have. You can also set the size of your UV maps per UV set or UV map. I should mention as an important side note here that even if you decide to subdivide during this merging or baking process, when you are ready to finally export your model outside of 3D Coat, In the export dialog, you'll have an export resolution option that allows you to select this original low polygon state that you see in the Retopo room, or the mid poly option, which is your subdivided state during this merging process. I'm ready now to hit the OK button and let 3D Coat go through the baking process. And you'll be surprised this sequential texture baking just how fast 3D Coat goes through it, even if you've got a lot of different layers. So I'll go ahead and skip forward just a bit. And here is our baking result. You'll notice in the lower right hand corner that 3D Coat created individual paint layers for all your Retopo meshes and your UV maps. So we'll stop right here and pick up in the next video where we're going to start texture painting. Stay tuned and we'll see you then.